To people who are sort of coming in and trickling into our Zoom meeting today, welcome to our, I think, 6th edition of our Watch-Klatsch on Babylon Berlin. We are really happy to see you all again, this time in a Zoom meeting. We thank you all so much for your flexibility and understanding in sort of circumventing some technical issues and being able to take this to the platform that isn't a webinar, but we do assure you that this is something that we'll switch back over to webinar next week for our final one on July 2nd. Goodness. So I just wanted to say, hello, my name is Raleigh Joyner. I'm from the Goethe-Institut, Washington, D.C. So I'm broadcasting out of Tacoma Park, Maryland. And I'm the cultural programs coordinator over at Goethe-Institut, Washington. We do have a chat feature, so we know that lots of people throughout the region NAM, North America, are tuning in today. So if you'd like to drop into the chat at any point, where you're from and say hello, feel free to do that. Oh no, somebody said, are we supposed to be hearing Raleigh now? Does everybody hear me? Jill, you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay. I'm sorry that somebody can't hear me. Maybe I would suggest that if anything goes wrong, maybe exit the meeting and try to come back in. That would be the best thing that I can recommend. I wish I could troubleshoot for you all, but I unfortunately cannot. But once again, thank you all so much for tuning in. We really appreciate the wonderful feedback that we've all gotten on this series. It's really nice to see that people have still this interest that continues with the Weimar sort of era and culture that is inspired by and informed by the Weimar era. And it's been really nice to see all of the wonderful questions and contributions and feedback that you all have sort of given us. It's been great to work with Hester these last sessions. And I am really happy today to say that we have 2 experts that we'll be talking with for episodes 4, 5, and 6. And those are Dr. Hester Baer and also Dr. Jill Suzanne Smith from Bowdoin College up in Maine. So just as a quick sort of overview, I'm just going to give a little bit of information on Hester. So she's an associate professor of German and Film Studies at the University of Maryland College Park, where she also serves as a core faculty member in the comparative literature program. She's published widely on German film, digital media, contemporary literature, and feminism. She's the author of Dismantling the Dream Factory, Gender, German Cinema, and the Post-War Quest for a New Film Language, published in 2009. And she has a new book coming up in 2020 that is called German Cinema in the Age of Neoliberalism. And Dr. Jill Suzanne Smith, she is the John C. Osterweis Associate Professor of German at Bowdoin College in Maine, where she is also an affiliated faculty member in Cinema Studies, Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and Urban Studies. She is the author of the book Berlin Coquette, Prostitution and the New German Woman, 1890 to 1933, which was published in 2013 by Cornell University Press. Her research and teaching focus on gender and sexuality, Jewish studies, and the city of Berlin from the Wilhelmine era, which is when Kaiser Wilhelm was the ruler, the emperor of Prussia. Sorry, me mentioning that got me off track. I just thought I would qualify that. To the present. Jill has published articles and essays in German Quarterly, the Journal of Modern Jewish Studies, and in recent volumes on women's writing in the 21st century and rebuilding Jewish life in Germany. And she's currently working on a book-length study of representations of Weimar Berlin in contemporary German literature and visual culture. So she's actually one of the first sort of scholars of Germanic studies who is currently, if I'm correct, publishing something that actually engages academically and scholarly on that level with Babylon Berlin. And so it's really exciting to have both of you here, and I really look forward to this conversation. And one last thing, just another thank you to the Friends of the Goethe-Institut, or FOGI, who have very generously supported us in funding this program. We really appreciate it. If you're interested in joining FOGI, I would highly recommend checking them out on our website. I can drop a link in sort of the post-show if you're interested in learning more about FOGI. And yeah, so just one last thing, just on the technical things. Since it is a Zoom meeting, we just ask that since the three of us are on camera, and everybody has the option, since it's a meeting, to be on camera, that everybody just make sure their camera is off, and make sure that their mic is off, just so that we can make sure that the sort of people talking are on screen. And otherwise, it sort of is going to function pretty much like a webinar, where if you have something that you'd like to say, this time it's going to streamline over to the chat, so questions and comments directed to the chat. And Jill and Hester still have the ability to screen share, and so yeah, if you have any questions, when we go to the question part and comment afterwards, it's going to just be changed over to chat. And I think that that's pretty much all the technical things that I wanted to point out. If you look at your panel at the bottom, it's kind of the same as a webinar. You still have the chat feature, and up in the top right-hand corner, if you haven't already, I would strongly recommend, at least for this session, to switch over to active speaker view, because if you do gallery view, you'll see a lot of black boxes, and that's probably not ideal. So instead, active speaker view would be something that I'd recommend for this time. So that's about all I have. Once again, thank you all for tuning in, and I will go ahead and mute myself and hand this over to Jill and Hester, who can take it away. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Raleigh, for all your work in putting this together. And this technical snafu this week was a little stressful, so thank you for working through it. I think it's gonna be great, and welcome to everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here again tonight. And I'm super excited that Jill Smith is joining me. She's been regularly participating as a viewer and questioner in these conversations so far. And it's really great that she can be here to engage in a visible and active dialogue with me about the show tonight. She was very kind to share some of her own writing about the show with me, which has really inspired a lot of the comments that I've been making through the first 5 of these Watch-Klatsch events. So it's great to have her talking, speaking for herself, and I'm really looking forward to the dialogue about the show tonight. So I just wanted to say, as usual, I'm coming to you from my house in Silver Spring, Maryland, where this massive thunderstorm just started. So if you hear thunderclaps or the lights go out, hopefully that won't happen, but you know what's going on. It's kind of crazy out my window right now. So as every week previously, I have put together some slides. Jill and I worked on them together, and I'm going to go ahead and click over to sharing those slides in a moment. But Jill, do you want to just jump in and say something first?
Yeah. Yes, I want to start by thanking Hester for sharing the platform with me this evening, and also to Raleigh so much for organizing this very rich programming and including me in it. So thank you very much to the Goethe-Institut for bringing me into this wonderful format and discussion, really lively discussion about Babylon Berlin. And thank you to my dear friend and Dr. Mutter Katrin Sieg, who told me about this in the first place. So she gets a shout out for letting me know that this was going on, because I was so happy to hear that it was going on in the first place. And I think that Hester is just the most fantastic person to have as our leader through these episodes of Babylon Berlin. So I'm excited to be here.
Great. All right, this is exciting. Jill is a scholar of Weimar, especially of gender and sexuality in Weimar. And since I am more of a post-war German cinema person who has kind of approached the show as a document of the present as much as of the past, I think this is going to be a great dialogue. So I'm going to go ahead and click over to my slides. Let's see. Okay, do you see them now, Jill?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just making sure. Okay, so we wanted to start out tonight by talking a little bit about the history and politics that are represented in these 3 episodes. We're talking about episodes 4, 5, and 6 of season 2, which are also numbered as episodes 12, 13, and 14 of Babylon Berlin. As we've been discussing, the first 2 seasons were created kind of as a piece and shot all together over a 7-month period. So there's these 2 numbering systems. But in these 3 episodes that we're going to focus on tonight, the visit of Aristide Briand to Berlin to meet with his counterpart, Gustav Stresemann, is thematized. It's an important facet of the historical representation that happens here. So I have an image up on the screen of the actual 2 guys, Aristide Briand and Gustav Stresemann, in the year that they were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And Jill is going to start by talking just a little bit about these 2 men and the historical events that the show is representing.
Great. So Gustav Stresemann was one of the most prominent political figures of the Weimar Republic. He served briefly as chancellor in 1923 at the height of the hyperinflation, which was really devastating to the economy of the early Weimar Republic. And then he served as foreign minister in most subsequent administrations, of which there were many, from 1924 until his death in 1929. In his brief term as chancellor, he and his finance minister introduced a new currency called the Rentenmark, which stabilized the economy for the first time since the end of the First World War. His work as foreign minister was one that sought to bring Germany back to the table with the Western Allies, and hence to take the country out of its political isolation. He really, before the First World War and through most of the First World War, Stresemann was a fairly ardent nationalist, and he really, that informed his perspective. He wanted to see Germany be a great European power again, but he wanted it also to be a partner. So in that spirit, he worked with his French counterpart, Aristide Briand, and negotiated the terms of the treaties of Locarno in 1925, which laid the groundwork for Germany's fulfillment of war reparation payments, which were very controversial in Germany and were part of the Treaty of Versailles. And also, though, for the withdrawal of French troops that occupied the Rhineland, and mostly French colonial troops, which was also, that created a racialized controversy since those troops were primarily Black troops, or at least were perceived to be such. That's not necessarily the case, but the fact that there were Black troops among them created this racialized propaganda campaign in Germany that was really quite ugly. But Briand also didn't want the occupying troops to be in the Rhineland for any amount of time. And as a very long-term career politician, he worked very hard with Stresemann. And it's for their work in Locarno that the 2 men won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1926, as you see on the slide. Just a little more information about Stresemann. He was a member of the DVP, or the German People's Party, which was considered to be to the right of the 3 main parties that formed what is usually known as the Weimar Coalition, which was the SPD, or the Social Democrats, the DDP, the German Democratic Party, and the Catholic Center Party. That said, over the course of his career, Stresemann became increasingly convinced of the merits of Weimar democracy and the potential it had to make Germany a trustworthy political partner within Europe. So he became increasingly enamored with a European idea that we see alive today in the European Union. In terms of fact-checking, while Briand and Stresemann continued to meet and haggle over various agreements together over the years, until Stresemann's death in 1929, I know of no source that has them going to the Threepenny Opera together, so someone can correct me, but in the spring of 1929, as this is shown in the show. Nor was there an Operation Prangertag, as the show would have us believe. So those are the things I have to say. I really like this slide right here, and if you'll recall that we see Briand giving a brief interview as they enter the theater. When asked to give his assessment of the German political situation at the time, he says, "Young democracies are always in danger," and the rest of the quote is, "but democracy is well worth fighting for." And then they enter the theater.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think the slides, demonstrate some really nice casting on the part of the show, I appreciate your pointing out the fact that all of this is fictionalized, essentially, this whole story about the visit to the Threepenny Opera and this whole story about Operation Prangertag that is the real focus of these episodes, kind of the build-up, the suspenseful build-up to that, and we're going to talk about that some more in a minute. But the fact that this is fictional is important, and as far as I know, the Schwarze Reichswehr, the black kind of shadow army that is such a focus of the show over these 2 seasons was not really active actually anymore in the late 20s.
Right, that's a good point. I think it's in many ways kind of, at least in 1929, it would have been more of a conglomerate of Stahlhelm, right, the steel helmets, and then the military powers who really, this General Seeger's character is close to von Seeckt, who was a general who really held a lot of, he was the head of the army, and that they really were allowed to be a state within a state. That's a quote that one reads a lot when one reads histories of Weimar, that the military really had its own show going on. And I think there's a great quote by Kattelbach in one of the episodes we watched for this evening, where he says, to Gerion, "Do you know what you're doing? You're taking on the state itself." And I think he means the state within the state, right? Of those military powers that be, and of course Hindenburg, who's going to come up later. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So another character that you wanted to say a little bit about is Benda, whose kind of development as a character really climaxes during these episodes. And Benda was partially modeled on Bernhard Weiß, who was the vice president of the Berlin police during the Weimar Republic. And so I'm excited to hear, so here we see a picture of Weiß, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts on him as a figure, and also sort of what traits of his have flowed into the characterization of Benda specifically.
Okay. Well, I mean, even just the visual, right? These, the round nickel glasses, I think is one of the reasons they didn't make them nickel, but they clearly gave him these trademark round glasses that Bernhard Weiß was known to wear. And as the slide says, he was the vice president of the Berlin police from 1927 until 1932, when he was actually driven out of office in the Red Burg, the Rote Burg, during what was called the Preußenschlag, or the Prussian, it was basically a Prussian coup, where many officials from the SPD, for instance, were just brought out of, were taken out of the police presidium in some in handcuffs. So he was known, Weiß was known for his very strong resistance to right-wing forces and his very tough actions against them. So he was one of the first voices to note the danger of the Nazis as an agitational power on the streets of Berlin. And he banned the SA, or the Sturmabteilung, the Nazi street fighters, sometimes they're called stormtroopers, which made him one of Joseph Goebbels, who was at this time Gauleiter of Berlin for the Nazi party, so basically the party leader within Berlin. Joseph Goebbels made him a major target of anti-Jewish propaganda, and the Nazi newspaper called Der Angriff, which is like the attack, is the translation into English. In that paper, Goebbels repeatedly raged against Weiß, calling him Isidor, which he considered a Jewish slur. And but Weiß actually remained in Berlin. One hears different accounts because there are a lot of fictionalizations, including the Kutscher later novels by Volker Kutscher, whose novels are the inspiration for Babylon Berlin. He includes Weiß as one of the characters, so that's something where the books get mixed in. But Weiß remained in Berlin until March of 1933. He was briefly arrested but released by the SA, and he went into exile in Prague first and then wound up in London, where he did survive the war, but died in the early 50s. An interesting parallel between him and Benda that is brought out in these episodes that we saw was that he did serve in the German army in the First World War, and with great distinction. He earned an Iron Cross, like many Jews, many German Jews did fight for their home country. That was perfectly natural, and one finds a great record of this. And this fact likely served as inspiration for the very powerful and, in my mind, very gratifying moment of touché in episode 14, which is a couple slides from now, when Benda proudly presents himself with the name, rank, and company to General Zegers, and sort of insists on being called, by his own military rank, and shows that he fought for his country. One of the major plot lines of these three episodes is that of August Benda, I think, as a real champion of democracy, probably one of the only, sort of this lone fighter. And as Hester has noted in previous presentations, I think there's very tactical casting done here in terms of Matthias Brandt being chosen as the youngest son of Willy Brandt, beloved SPD chancellor from the 1960s and early 70s. So, but what I find potentially troubling about Benda's character is how much it gets overloaded with, it really has a lot to carry in terms of being, the sole champion of democracy, fighting, eventually in vain, with only Gerion, who, as we've said, whose political, allegiances are kind of vacuous, or we just don't know where he stands. And then a few judges, right, we see in the background who are willing to support the subpoenas, etc. But he really seems to be the only one who wants to see justice done to the military leaders, who would, of course, as we know, rather see the Kaiser return. So a heavy burden for this character, who is the only, as we've said before, as it has been said before, the only clearly defined Jewish character. So big burden for that character to bear, I would say.
Yeah, and of course, this characterization and this burden that Benda has to bear are building towards, plot lines that climactically occur in the last two episodes of the season. And as usual, we are trying to avoid spoilers in case some of you out there have not seen the last two episodes of season 2. But please come back next week and we'll be talking about what happens next. I think it's very interesting across these three episodes, how the show, through the character of Benda and this kind of burden that he bears, develops this kind of visualization of the fantasy, the failed fantasy of defending the Weimar Republic and defending democracy against the rise of the right, the extreme right. This kind of this kind of battle against reactionary forces that takes place in using the markers of the kind of suspense and detective genre across these episodes. We're rooting for Rat and we're rooting for Bende as they kind of put together the evidence against all odds. And we see, for instance, the surprising addition of the train manifest that Rat's former landlady, Elisabeth Benke, passes over the balcony to him. He says, "It literally fell into my hands." That demonstrates Seeger's signature and thus provides clear evidence of the involvement of this circle of aristocratic and military people in the smuggling of poison gas into Berlin. So there are these great moments where we see small victories in the broader fight, right? But parallel to that is also an intensification, I think, of the show's representation of anti-Semitism, which is still, as you point out, very limited, also because the overtly Jewish characters are very limited here. But Zwergiebel, whom we see here, who was what was his exact title? Head of the police?
He was police president, yeah.
Police president, is based on a real character. I mean, in the case of Bernhard Weiß, they chose to sort of make some changes to the historical record and rename that character as Bende. But in the case of Zwergiebel, as we've talked about before, the character is based on an actual historical person who was also Jewish. And I think this scene is one of those moments when the kind of anti-Semitism of this aristocratic and military elite is depicted more specifically when Wendt comes in and kind of boxes the ears of Zwergiebel and tells him, you know, you've got to stop this investigation. And then we have this great moment where Bende tells Rat, I think the quote in German is, "Der Gegner ist stark und überall." The opponent is strong and pervasive. And then, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, there's also that awful moment when Bende is interrogating Zegers by himself, except with the only other person in the room is Doris, the stenotypist, when
right.
Zegers says, "Please watch, you know, what you say." Right? It basically says, you know, you find yourself on deutschen Boden, right? So you are just an occupant, you know, just a resident in this country and not an actual citizen, and which is wrong. Yeah, Jews were citizens, and Bende is so shocked and really hurt. That's a very well written moment, I think, but really horrid.
Absolutely. And this is the moment that you were referring to before, which is, you know, another one of these standoffs between Zegers and Bende, where Bende gets a little bit of comeuppance by, you know, Zegers tells him, you need to refer to me by my military title. And Bende demonstrates that he also had a military rank. And so really does belong, is one of them in this sense, right? But the comeuppance doesn't unfortunately last for long. I've been talking a lot about the role of the radio and sort of radio transmission and audiovisual media more broadly in the show. And I think it's quite interesting that here again we have an example. Rat is at home with, or in the hotel where he's staying with Helga and Moritz, and he hears a radio broadcast that talks about the visit of Stresemann and Briand to the Threepenny Opera at the Theater am Schiffbauer Damm, and it's mentioned that today is Prangertag, and Rat has previously heard Prangertag is the name of a secret operation. It may be a coup or an assassination attempt, but no one knows the details, and he hears this radio broadcast, and he's maybe in a bit of a susceptible state because he's just come out of a drug-induced stupor, part of his treatment by Dr. Schmidt with the new drugs that are really much stronger than the drugs he's been taking before. And so in this kind of susceptible state, he hears this radio broadcast and he puts two and two together and heroically steps in to interrupt Prangertag and is in fact able to stop the assassination from taking place. And as Benda tells him later, his heroic intervention at the very last minute may have prevented a coup d'etat. But of course, then the show kind of brutally revokes that win. I also wanted to just point out here with the topic of audiovisual media and visual prosthetics that we've been discussing in regards to the first 2 seasons of the show, this really amazing kind of split screen, quadri-screen shot where we see Walter behind the scope of the gun and the other assassin and their guns trained on the 2 men.
This really reminds me of a crime show that came out, I think 2010. No, actually, well, 2000. In any case, by Dominik Graf, who called Im Angesicht des Verbrechens, or Face to Face with the Crime, and made quite a splash in Germany, at least. And Graf has been a director for years, a crime series director, and he loves this four-paned shot when things are starting to get tense in the krimi mode. And I wonder if it's a reference to Graf, or some things that have been used in recent crime series that are also based in Berlin. But that's just a side note.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I'll thank my dad for this observation, but the whole scene in the theater with the Threepenny Opera for Operation Prangertag is also very reminiscent of Godfather 3, the final 30 minutes of the show, of the film by Francis Ford Coppola, which takes place in the opera and involves an assassination attempt as well. And the sort of cross-cutting and the tension that's established and the emphasis on sight lines and also the theme of the gangster that we'll talk about in a minute when we come to talk a little bit more specifically about the Threepenny Opera, I think is quite present there. So yes, there's a lot of resonance for the visual construction of this sequence, I think. And so yes, Rat very successfully disrupts this assassination plot, but unfortunately, history intervenes, and the show kind of brutally revokes these successes that Benda and Rat seem to be accumulating in fighting against the rise of the right and fighting against this coup attempt at the end of this episode 14. The 2 men have to admit that they have lost once Hindenburg comes and shows up and makes an administrative decision that disallows the investigation from proceeding, and Benda is forced to give this very humiliating press conference when he was supposed to, announce the indictment of Zegars. He has to go in front of this large group of journalists and say the conference is canceled. Okay, so we'll come back maybe a little bit to the Prangertag later on, but we wanted to talk some more about the Threepenny Opera, which is obviously one of the most famous and important cultural productions of the Weimar period, and which forms a backdrop to the Prangertag episode. And so Jill, what do you want to tell us about the Threepenny Opera?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the Threepenny Opera is without a doubt one of the most enduring and therefore most easily recognized works of the Weimar period. I mean, I'm currently working on I'm surveying how the mainstream media has covered the Weimar Republic within Germany, but also a little bit in the American and British press. And it's like a red thread, just Threepenny Opera, Threepenny Opera, Threepenny Opera comes up whenever there's a list of, what's the Weimar canon? We hear Threepenny Opera. So it's very, it will be familiar to a lot of viewers of the show. it is a collaborative work. I'm really glad that Hester emphasized that on the slide, because it's collaborative in several different ways. It's a collaboration between Bertolt Brecht and Elisabeth Hauptmann, who didn't get much credit except as a translator, but it was because she was the only one whose English was good enough to translate the literary inspiration for the play, or actually basis for the play, which was John Gay's 18th century play, The Beggar's Opera. She translated that from English into German, starting in the later 20s, and it's also, of course, a collaboration between Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill, composer, whose songs made the show a very popular hit. So even if Brecht was trying to get certain political messages across, there's that major tension. I would argue the popular definitely won here rather than over the political, but certainly we can talk about that more. Once Brecht and Weill got word that the up-and-coming theater producer Ernst Josef Aufricht was looking for a play for his modest Theater am Schiffbauerdamm, the project took off, but it went through so many revisions that it was barely ready for its premiere on August 31st of 1928. Some of the actors noted how stressful, they were still rehearsing the day of, in the hours leading up to the premiere. It is noteworthy that it premiered at a theater and not at a traditional opera house, because this was an anti-opera opera, right? This was not culinary theater. Brecht wrote extensively about getting away from a bourgeois luxury model of the theater. On the one hand, getting away from realist theater, but on the other, getting away from a culinary experience, as he called it, right, where people could just go, be entertained, and not think, and not keep thinking, and sort of numb any sort of potential for political consciousness. So the fact that it did premiere at the Theater am Schiffbauerdamm is relevant and quite important. And it was, when I say it's an anti-opera opera, I mean, it's a piece that combined spoken word and interspersed songs, which was not that common at the time. So kind of what we think of as our musical, right, the musical model. And it was accompanied by not by an orchestra, but by a jazz band. So very modern, very edgy, a modern musical, to be sure. So by all accounts, the premiere was a smashing success, with the audience demanding repeat performances of several key songs, often right after they had been performed. And of course, among them, the Moritat that is so cleverly interwoven from episodes 9, then through episode 13 with the organ grinder. I know we're going to see that. And then in episode 14, Bruno Wolter is actually whistling it as he packs up his gun to go to the Prangertag, and whistling it again as he enters the theater, the Theater am Schiffbauerdamm. And then, of course, and I know this slide will come up, that Moritz, Gerion's nephew, or we don't know, nephew, son, that was talked about last week, is heard whistling it and claims to Gerion, it's Maki Messa, everyone knows this, right? And that he thinks Gerion's rather square by not knowing it. And indeed, Moritz was right. The sensation known as Threepenny Fever gripped Berlin and beyond in the months following the show's premiere, leading to the release of a phonograph of Weill's hit songs. So there were lots of different renditions of this. There were like sheet music with the faces of the different actors, and it was huge. The show's creators may latch on rather accurately to Weill's Moritat as a popular hit, but they play it rather fast and loose, once again, when it comes to Brecht and Hauptmann's play. So, for example, there's no shootout at the end of Act 1, and Act 1 is presented in the series as absurdly condensed. This happened in an example also of Menschen am Sonntag in the newsreel that Hester talked about, I believe it was, last week. Jumping from a quote from the opera's first scene in Peacham's Business of Fake Beggars, which is actually a really great quote about the increasing coldness and hardness of humankind. And then it jumps to this non-existent shootout that we see on the slide, perhaps meant to be the arrest of the master thief and rogue protagonist Macheath. I don't know what they're getting at here. There's a good deal of tension in how the Threepenny Opera is represented in Babylon Berlin. I would say on the one hand, according to the radio announcer that Geryon hears, and this was on the slide that Hester just showed, it's a national cultural phenomenon capable of restoring, quote, the worldwide reputation of German theater. In other words, it's a source of national pride. But on the other, it is for sure a piece of popular theater that is a collaboration between a communist leftist, a committed leftist writer, communist Brecht, a woman, Elizabeth Hauptmann, and a Jewish composer, Kurt Weill. And it may take place in London, but it was seen by most contemporaries and still is understood as being very much a product of 1920s Berlin, the Berlin of gangsters, beggars, and prostitutes, not unlike the one we see in the series. And I think the most telling shot is the one that gets repeated 3 times over the course, like in this whole Prangotag episode. I think the most telling shot is the one that gets repeated 3 times over the courses of episodes 13 and 14, and that's of the flag that's waving over the top of the theater, which is the German Republican flag of black, red, and gold. A democratic, showing the theater as a democratic site of innovation and collaboration. So, I mean, in Hester's viewing questions for this week, was, what do you make of the site of this show and the theater itself as, as the site for the Prangotag operation? I think it's the right wing going against everything that they despise, right? People like Brecht, the theater as experimental site, Jewish composers, women as work, everything. So the fact that that flag doesn't come down is probably more of a sense of triumph or lasting triumph, at least of the Republic, than anything that actually happens in the plot. So.
Thanks, that's great. Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I mean, you had mentioned before this question about why they choose to put a shootout on the stage, which is historically inaccurate in terms of how the show was produced originally in Berlin in the 1920s. And, in the plot of Babylon Berlin, there's this idea that when the shot goes off is when Bruno is going to, or when the 2 assassins, Bruno and the other assassin, are going to pull the trigger, and the sort of shooting on the stage is going to shroud the noise of the shooting up above in the opera boxes. But I also think this choice, this kind of taking liberties with the show, the original Threepenny Opera, is quite interesting because it does really place this emphasis on the culture of kind of gangsters and sadistic masculinity, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later on. This kind of violent culture, of gangster-like culture of Berlin in the late 1920s. So I just wanted to kind of throw that in there, and maybe we'll come back to that soon. So Jill mentioned all of these instances when the Moritat von Mackie Messer, otherwise known as Mac the Knife, is woven through these episodes. We see the actor on stage at the very outset of the performance singing the song. Of course, this is a slide from previous weeks. We have already in episode 9, the first episode of season 2, seen this phonograph and heard strains of the song very faintly, kind of setting up the significant role that the song and the Threepenny Opera play in this season. And it's interesting that there's a connection somehow always to violence when the song is whistled or when we hear the song. And an example of that is the images of the organ grinder who is playing the song. These images of the organ grinder frame the scene in which Greta witnesses Fritz being shot. And then we also have some interesting character development around Moritz in this set of episodes. And Moritz, the nephew or son of Geryon Rath, who whistles the tune and gets into a little conversation, as Jill mentioned, with Geryon about the tune. And we see Moritz, and I've got the slide in a minute, also shooting guns with Bruno Wolter in this episode. I think we'll move on, Jill, unless you had anything else you wanted to mention about the Threepenny Opera or the Moitat.
I mean, the Moitat is also a very violent song, right? I mean, it describes how that Mac is he's not just a thief, he's a rapist and a murderer, right? So I think that this perhaps even just exposes the violence inherent in the lyrics of this very kind of sound, especially the jazzed up version of Mac the Knife that was then made popular by Bobby Darin, right? That you don't even think about, especially for Americans, we don't think of that darker side of the song.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a couple brief observations about some of the other kind of intertextual references in these episodes. As with, I think, every week of the Watch-Klatsch so far, I'm going to have to come back to the film Menschen am Sonntag, People on Sunday from 1930, which once more shows up here. And I think it's interesting, the connection in this episode. Lotte is exhausted and she just wants to sleep, and of course she can't get any sleep at her own place, so she goes over to Rudy's apartment, but he's having a threesome, and so she instead goes to the Kino and kind of takes a nap, as we see here at the movie theater, and Menschen am Sonntag is playing again. And I think it's interesting, in the film People on Sunday, one of the characters, Annie, who's a model, portrayed as a model, she stays home. We see her, she's introduced as a character at the very beginning, but she stays home and doesn't go to the lake because she's so exhausted and she just wants to sleep. And she also maybe wants to avoid spending the day with these kind of self-centered machos, Erwin and Wolfgang, the male characters in the film. And I think it's interesting how the film is then brought into connection here with Lotte's exhaustion, which is a topic that maybe we can return to later. There's an interesting moment in, I can't remember which episode it's in right now, where Rat gives Lotte Stefan Jeneke's notebook, which he has recovered from Bruno Wolter's desk, and he tells her he can't decipher what's written in the notebook because it's been written in shorthand, and Lotte can read shorthand, so he tells her, take this notebook home and go in aller Ruhe, go, use your quiet time at home to read through this and then come back and tell me what it says. And, again, emphasizing Rat's absolute cluelessness about the circumstances of Lotte's background and what it's like at her home, not quiet at all. Okay, so interesting, someone mentioned this in the comments last week, and it's something that I raised at the very beginning, but here we have an explicit reference, a couple of interesting explicit references to Fassbinder's 1980 miniseries Berlin Alexanderplatz, his adaptation of the Alfred Döblin novel of the same title. And in Fassbinder's miniseries, which is a very interesting adaptation of the novel, and highly recommend if you're interested in this period and in sort of later resonant cultural representations of this period. Günter Lamprecht plays the protagonist, Franz Bieberkopf, and in another instance of Babylon Berlin's very kind of resonant and clever casting, here Lamprecht, I think he's 90 now, shows up in a cameo playing President Paul von Hindenburg in episode 14 of Babylon Berlin. And I think especially in the way that Babylon Berlin draws this connection between sex and violence that we've talked about in some detail several times before, a kind of connection that is emblematic of the Weimar period, I think, for a lot of people. It often cites a kind of production style that's very reminiscent of Fassbinder's piece, which takes its theme really from this interconnection between sex and violence in the Weimar period. And there's this opening shot in episode, I'm losing my track of the episode, the first episode that we are talking about. tonight. There's this shot where Moritz is standing on top of the roof of the steelworks, and he hears this couple having sex, and he looks down, and then he dumps his bottle of bugs on top of them, and it's this kind of ugly, nasty scene that really reminds me in its kind of stylization of some of the sequences, the kind of production design of Fassbinder's miniseries. And we've seen before kind of the influence of this 70s and 80s version of Weimar culture through kind of cabaret and Brian Ferry and David Bowie and other cultural figures who make appearances or lend their aesthetic to Babylon Berlin. And I think the kind of filtering of certain scenes through that lens of the 70s and 80s depiction of Weimar culture is very visible once again here. So those were some, I guess, some just short thoughts on some of the intertextual references, a topic that we've been pursuing. Jill, did you want to say anything more about that before we move on?
We can move on. I just think you mentioned Rudy having a threesome. You know, the fact that comes right before the clip from Menschen am Sonntag is shown, I think is also a really clever reference to the film and this idea of four people going away for a day together and the sexual tensions there. But I think it's much more playful in that scene than I think you've talked so well about the mix of sex and violence that's or the darker sides of this sexual flirtation that happens in Menschen am Sonntag. And so I think that's there more in relation to the Goethe and Fritz storyline, and here it's being more playful. So.
Great. So, I mean, one of the questions that I had posed for tonight is this question about in what ways or to what extent do you see cultural references as being important for the form and content of Babylon Berlin, and how these citations affect our viewing, how our knowledge of or understanding of these citations might affect our viewing, or how we might view the show if we're unfamiliar with all of these citations. And for those of us who study German cinema and study Weimar culture, it's always such a fun puzzle to trace back these citations. But I would be interested in hearing more from some of the audience members tonight about this question, and also Jill, if you feel like commenting on it more in the Q&A period, that would be great. But let's move on and just talk briefly about the question of plot lines and characterization. One of the big reveals in these episodes happens when the police meet and look at the ballistics data for the murder of the priest, Joseph, sorry, go ahead. Jenike's murder, and realized that the same gun shot both of these men. And there's this wonderful scene when Rat and Walter are sitting at the table, and slowly the realization sets in that they are responsible for these murders in one way or the other because of the bullet, the shell casing that Walter had given to Rat after the shooting that took place at the very beginning of season 1 on the rooftops when the men are chasing Krajewski, and Rat had taken this shell casing and switched it out at the morgue, and so Walter realizes what must have happened, and Rat realizes that Walter indeed must have been responsible for the shooting of Jenike because he is the person who is in possession of the gun. So this great exchange of looks, and it's paralleled here again when Rat kind of lets Lotte in on his suspicions of Bruno and of what's going on in general inside the police, and the two of them look around with these very suspicious glances, again thinking about the topic that we talked about last time, the kind of corruption of the institutions and the sense that, as Benda puts it, the opponent is strong and pervasive everywhere. There's this sinking, creeping suspicion that's really visualized through these relays of gazes in these episodes about what's going on. And yeah, Jill, maybe you want to just mention something about this scene.
I just think it's one of the most masterfully constructed scenes in terms of dramatic tension in the entire first and second seasons, in the sense that one really thinks that, or one remains uncertain until the very last second as to whether or not Walter is going to shoot Moritz in the head. And the fact that you see the cabbage explode, and then he says, and then we see that Moritz is the shooter. Yeah, I think it's brilliant.
Yeah. And, you know, again, in the terms of sort of plot lines and characterization in these episodes, Rat and Walter, who initially were really sort of aligned, find themselves on opposite sides, of course, opposite sides regarding Operation Prangertag, and on opposite sides maybe regarding their relationship to Moritz. Bruno seems to really be taking him under his wing and helping him learn how to shoot, and this sequence is just very creepy, you know, both for the reasons that you pointed out and because we then see Moritz shooting and the kind of encouragement that he's receiving from Walter, who says, respect, you know, is very impressed with his skill, and this is laying the seeds, I think, in important ways for plot developments that come later on.
Yeah, and even when they first, when Moritz and Walter first meet, right, they start doing the boxing, right? So it's all about, I believe Walter calls him young Schmeling, yeah, referring to the boxing heavyweight champion Max Schmeling, who was also a heartthrob at the time, and was even in movies in Weimar. So there's this whole sense of macho culture that Walter represents that Gerion does not in the eyes of Moritz. So I think that's really right. This is one of those ways, and Raleigh has spoken about this too, sort of, and you mentioned last week, right, Walter playing dumb and asking certain questions about the boy, and then using his own assumed knowledge to have a position of power over Gerion in some way, really manipulative.
Exactly. And you know, another of the moments of reveal, I think, is done in this beautiful visual sequence. Here we see the slides from a previous week, when this is what Stefan Jeneke sees when he's trapped inside the steelworks and about to be shot. He sees this blurry image, and then here we are again. And in this wonderful sequence, Rat goes to this crime scene, and he is trying to reconstruct what might have happened, and the image comes into focus, and it is the face of Bruno Walter. And of course, this is one more of Rat's kind of hallucinations. Walter is not actually standing there. It's the duty officer who's guarding the crime scene who steps in and tells him, you know, we really did search everywhere for the notebook and we couldn't find it. But I think it's a very nice kind of visualization of Walter's guilt in the shooting of Stefan. And this scene is also very important, and I just wanted to make sure to highlight it, and we'll come back again a little bit more next week to the character of Greta and her role this season. Here she goes to find her erstwhile boyfriend Fritz, and at the Communist Party headquarters, she can't find him. Otto, always kind of a nefarious character, shows up and is holding on to her as she witnesses Fritz being shot. And then later on, in another one of these moments where in these episodes we see more overt anti-Semitism appearing, Otto comes to Benda's house and talks to Greta, and he says an anti-Semitic slur ordered this murder of your boyfriend. And Greta says, tell me what to do, I'll do it. It doesn't matter what you're going to ask, I'm going to do it. So this is a very, very important plot development here. Earlier, we've seen Fritz visit Greta at Benda's house, and the two kind of playfully flirt. It has once more some overtones of violence. Fritz is throwing around china, and it's very stressful for Greta. And then they have sex on Benda's desk, actually. And I think it's quite interesting here, as at other times in the series so far, Fritz is always referring to Greta as doll or Puppe. When Lotte is then kidnapped by this guy Max, we've encountered him before at the train yard where he was flirting with Lotte. He sees her now on the streetcar, and he says, go on, get in, doll, calls her Puppe again. And that's when they chloroform her, and she's kidnapped and taken away. And I think it's just interesting, the use of this term doll to label these women. It's very specifically used for the two working class women in the show. Helga is not being referred to by anyone as doll, and it is this kind of symptom or language around the misogynistic treatment of these characters, and their manipulation by the kind of sadistic men in the show, which is a topic that we also wanted to talk about. Jill, do you want to maybe just say a few things about that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I adore Lotte, and I can't get enough of her, but I could definitely, I like the scenes where she's not being strangled or chloroformed much better than I like these. Because I mean, I think that political violence certainly has its place in a series on Weimar. That can be argued. And of course, there were also sexually violent crimes that occurred in Weimar, so I don't want to say that that's not true, but there's a lot of gratuitous and aestheticized violence enacted upon Lotte's body in these past couple episodes. I mean, let's just think about it, right? In the final episodes of the series, she is beaten, chloroformed, kidnapped, chained by an iron ankle brace, choked and shut in a freezer, and nearly hacked up, as you can see on the slide, and made into a dish for the upscale diners at the Mocha FT, right? So, and if we think about the opening of episode 13, it dwells upon her growing desperation. That's where she wakes up and realizes that she's chained in this secret room in the Mocha FT that's basically Edgar's apartment, where he's also, that's where the films were also kept when the Geryon men took out in season 1. And we hear her quickened breathing and her strained moans as she pulls on the chains, while the camera sharpens its focus on the chains, and leaves her face in a soft haze. And I just think that it seems like that really encouraged me to look at the series with a more critical, feminist eye, to just pay attention to which characters are kept in chains, literally and figuratively, by the creators. So this idea of Puppe is interesting. It is a sort of Berliner Bub kind of thing, right? So working class guys tend to be, hey, Puppe, and that's, but there's also, women artists like Jeanne Mamen. You can find they're one of her watercolors is called Langweilige Puppen, and it is like bored and boring dolls that shows two made up, fairly bourgeois women with bobbed haircuts. So I don't know if Puppe is per se as bad, but she's, I think, also making fun of a certain type of woman in that watercolor itself. But you're right, the way it's used in the series, and certainly the characters with whom it's identified, are these misogynist, kind of dangerous figures. I mean, we remember when we meet Max Fuchs and he's at the train station and he's flirting with Lotte, the other guys around warn her to stay away from him because he's known as Reinstecker Fuchs, which is a play on the Reineke Fuchs, or the clever fox, but he's actually the fox that likes to stick his, who likes to penetrate people, right? So he's already marked as pretty naughty and dangerous. So that takes a much darker turn when he becomes their kidnapper. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting, and I hope the participants would like to talk a little bit more about this question of the representation of women and violence against women, really brutality against women, torture of women in these episodes. I mean, I think there's one way that you can see this kind of emphasis on the limits of women's emancipation in the 20s and the emergent, changing ideologies of gender in the early 1930s and beyond, and we're rooting for Lotte, and she fights back, right? Like she kicks the bald guy in the crotch, and we're really rooting for her against these brutal men, and there's a way in which the show is able to use this kind of violence as a way of really making visible the pervasive misogyny at the time, but I think it would be interesting to hear, other people's perception of this violence. And it doesn't stop here, let's say, right? In the last 2 episodes, it only escalates, as you'll see when you finish watching the series. So we'll definitely come back to this topic next week as well. Thank you, Jill, for this amazing image. I'm excited to hear what you have to say about it.
Okay, so this is my last little, this is the last part of my presentation because it's the one that's close to my heart and to my head. Right? So intellectually, it's what occupied me for a long time, which is this an eroticized image of the typist, right? The stenotypist. That is Lotte's day job, right? So I immediately thought of the Tippmamsell and this image that I came across way back when I was doing research for my dissertation that later became my book. And it appears in a book, actually, that has several volumes called a moral history of the post-war period, so post-World War I, edited by Magnus Hirschfeld, who has come up in an earlier presentation by Hester, who was a prominent, if not the most prominent, sexologist working in Berlin at the time. So I won't get into too much detail on that. You can watch previous Watch-Klatsches and get more information on Hirschfeld or look at the source list. But these moral histories are very rich in illustrations as well, and that's one of their strengths. And they contain various essays by contemporary male observers of the time. I think there are a few essays by women as well. But this really just struck me, right? The typewriter, but then the crossed legs, and she's wearing nothing but the garter and the shoes, right? The stockings, the garter, and the shoes. And this made me think of Lotte and some of the reactions I've heard, some of the more critical reactions I've heard to her character, because I find her, and I think most people I know find her completely charming and compelling, and we're really rooting for her. But Volker Kutscher himself, I heard a reading that he did at Brandeis in the fall of 2018, at which he expressed his disappointment regarding the showrunner's decision to make his Charlie Ritter, who was a law student from a petite bourgeois background, into Lotte, a quote-unquote casual prostitute, in his words, right? So Gelegenheitsprostituierte is what he said. But I actually applaud the makers of the show for presenting us with a rather nuanced image of this precarious form of new womanhood. I think it shows the depth of their research into the time period, because the time period was actually rife with images like this one of the Tippmamsell, that eroticized the female white-collar worker, and also with stories of real women workers who simply could not make the rent without also working as prostitutes. So I know from going onto the Babylon Berlin website, their official website, where they list some of their key sources, that one of those sources was Kurt Morek's Guide to Naughty Berlin, which has since been reissued in the last couple of years. You can get it in any Berlin bookstore. Which not only includes very detailed description of Berlin nightclubs, but it also discusses the phenomenon of what's called the 5 o'clock ladies, who left their day jobs only to move to the next shift of work, soliciting subtly or not so subtly, in the lobbies of hotels, on the Potsdamer Platz, or in cafes and entertainment venues. So just one point of information that I want people to know, which is by 1929, when the series takes place, the state regulation of prostitution under paragraph 361, clause 6, had been abolished and replaced with a different type of regulation that by the health authorities, which was the aim of which was reducing the spread of venereal diseases. And that there was a law that was passed in 1927 called the Law to Combat Venereal Diseases, which effectively decriminalized prostitution and ostensibly treated all potential spreaders of venereal disease, regardless of gender, that's really important, as dangers to social health. So for the first time, actually, men were considered to be spreaders of venereal disease and not just prostitutes, right? So much more factually based. Those who remember the scene in season 1 between Lotta's mother, Minna Ritter, and the proletarian doctor, Dr. Volker, will recall that Dr. Volker asks Minna Ritter about her past sexual partners and wants to know particular names. And had the man who gave Minna her syphilis, from which she dies, we've seen that in these recent episodes, had he still been alive, Dr. Volker would have been obligated under that law to contact him and also to track him down and make sure he wasn't spreading the disease. So just one more point to note, it's actually really notable that the municipal government in Berlin was one that most enthusiastically embraced the law. So a lot of places in Germany, they just ignored this new law. But in Berlin, it was really, they followed through on it, including provisions that allowed prostitutes to choose their own doctors, and the state would pay for regular health exams, etc. So less invasive, but more chosen kind of health precautions for prostitutes as workers. And we should also note that when regulation was in place, Berlin was one of the laxest cities in terms of police regulation. So this makes Bruno's earlier blackmailing of Lotte, in my mind, seem rather absurd. So.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay. I'm gonna stop the slide share now, and I think we talked a lot already, so thank you so much. It was great to hear all of your thoughts, and I'm gonna invite Raleigh back in now to maybe start moderating the discussions. I'm looking forward to everyone's questions. Again, you can put those into the chat function if you have not done so already.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jill and Hester, so much for that wonderful, amazingly prepared presentation and awesomely coordinated and bouncing off each other. I thought that was just great the way you guys sort of put that together and sort of went off each other. And so, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and go through the chat. I see that the chat has already sort of been rolling, which is great because people are already sort of thinking about some things as you all have been talking. So I'm just going to dive right in. As far as we've had sort of an ongoing conversation about Walter, and so especially in these episodes as his character continues to be developed, we have quite a few comments on sort of the complexity of Walter. So as I think now we can all see in the chat because it's meeting, Linda mentions, but even Walter is not portrayed as a cartoon villain, don't you think? We see this in his relation to Emmy, his wife, and also perhaps since he doesn't shoot Moritz there too, albeit he is clearly one of the major villains of the piece. And Marlon adds in, Walter also helps Lotte get her paperwork so she can find honest work, so his motives are unclear, and they're certainly mixed and suspect. And then Yuan mentions, although, Walter is blackmailing Lotte for sex, the comments like, well, that was earlier, and then so now he's providing her with paperwork and also the funds so her mother can be buried. So yeah, he does sort of alternate between what is with this guy, and I find that that's interesting. But yeah, I mean, we're now 6 episodes into this, or sorry, 6 discussions into this series, and we're still trying to crack Volta. And so it's interesting, you know, we're still trying to figure him out, and it's yeah, very interesting that people are still not sure what to make of him, because I mean, yeah, it's true. I mean, he's a murderer. He blackmails somebody for sex. He does plenty of awful things, and at the same time, he's got this other side to him. So, what do you all think about that? I mean, we've talked about that every time, but as he continues to develop, have your thoughts changed, or have you thought of new things about the way he's presented?
I mean, I think one of the moments for me where I thought, and I've been kind of, you know, sorry, Hester, I've been pestering you now and then on the Q&A in the past about the show kind of transmitting a perspective about sex work through the Walter-Lotte interaction. And there's this is not in the 3 episodes that we saw for this week, but in the episodes you saw for last week's Watch-Klatsch, there was a scene where Walter comes to give her the papers, right, to present her with the papers, and then as they're having this conversation, the Witwe, the madam comes in and she says, "Oh, someone's asking for your type," to Lotte, and Lotte says, "Yeah, I'll be right there." And he looks, there's a close-up, and he says, you're just gonna keep working," and she basically, you know, there's a close-up of her, there's a reverse shot where she says, "I need the money." And I wonder if there's sort of this judgment in his voice. I wonder if the show is transmitting, and I know Hester disagrees with me, and that's totally fine. I think that he is such, what makes these first 2 seasons so great is how complex he is and how well he's played by Peter Kroot. So, I mean, he's one of the quintessential Berlin characters in my opinion. And he's played to a T, right? He gives us more to hold on to than we have in some of the more complex and confusing plot lines, but he continues to like vex us. I don't know, but I think that I keep going back to something, Raleigh, that you said a few weeks ago, was just like he sits there like a big cat once he's gotten his way
with the belly, yeah,
greased, right, and greased up and self-satisfied. And yet one of the first things he says to Lotte when she enters the room and realizes that he's the client is, he says, "Don't worry, I only dance standards." And so there's this whole weird mix of the traditional reactionary and this sort of, you know, is he a teddy bear type kind of, that keeps us wondering until we know that he is really a brutal killer. Like he's prepared. He's incredibly committed to the image of Germany that gets built up in that war reenactment scene that takes place in his apartment. That's who he is. And he may not want to kill a child, right, Moritz, but he's still, as I said in a previous comment tonight, using it to manipulate Galeon. I think it's all about pulling strings, and in the end, he's gonna do what he needs to do to make the Black Reichswehr get what they want and need for their plans.
Yeah, and I was going to also say that just it sort of also connects kind of well with what we sort of concluded our last conversation with, as we were talking about the police, where it's kind of like, what do we take away from portrayals of the police in these episodes, in the show in general? And in my opinion, it was just kind of something that's still very salient today, the idea that no matter how much personally you may be drawn to a person, or how much you may find them to be a complex person who is not entirely evil, which it's hard to find somebody who's entirely evil out there, just completely devoid of anything good about them at all. There's a couple, but yeah, like the idea that people having to reconcile that the people who can be good or complex and people who can do good things can also be part of a corrupt and violent and bad system. And I think that connects well with Linda in the chat, her comment, meaning that the show doesn't stereotype Nazis as all evil, but like we've been talking about in past conversations, has regular people who are deeply violent politically and maybe not personally. And she cites Emmy, and also that makes me think of Hester's commentary throughout this series, where she mentions that a big core part of this show is to portray what it's like for these people to sort of transition into eventually accommodating the Third Reich. And that kind of idea that
and I think this whole storyline with Emmy is very interesting, because on the one hand, we do see these moments of tenderness between the married couple, and one very pronounced one when Bruno goes off to, what he thinks is going to be assassinating the foreign minister, and perhaps will lead to his death. And he very tenderly tells her, I've had a wonderful go with you, or whatever he says. On the other hand, though, she's characterized as an alcoholic who's really drowning her sorrows all the time in alcohol, and to the point of passing out and not really being able to tell reality from hallucination in a different way than what we see with some of the other characters, right? And there's this really kind of awful scene, I think, in one of these episodes, where Rat breaks into the house and goes through the desk, and he's aware that Emmy is in the apartment, and he's kind of hiding from her, and then he takes her darning needles and uses them to break into the desk to retrieve the notebook that he's convinced is in Bruno's locked drawer. But then he terrifies Emmy, and then kind of manipulates her, again, as the men do, into thinking that he's just stopping by to pick something up that he's left behind. And so I think even within this kind of complex characterization of Bruno as somebody who isn't just purely evil, there is also a very kind of concerted way that he allows his wife to suffer, that the show really draws our attention to again and again, right?
Yeah. And on the sort of topic of complexity in the characters, Antonio brings up Benda. He says that Benda may be a hero for facing the extreme right, but he's an accomplice of the shooting on May 1st, and he's happy with the disappearance of Stefan. And he says, is it my impression that General Ziege accuses him of being an alien or a Jew, and then he kind of backs up instead of facing that accusation? And then also he comments, when I think in response to when I was saying, like the ambivalence and complexity of characters, that the show does in fact have bad guys that have nothing good to offer. And he's like, I'm thinking of Nissen and Zager and his crowd. And so, yeah, he does make the point that there are people who, like represent just nothing good. And then there's, people like Volter and Rath who do bad things and are part of corrupt systems, but they do have good qualities. But yeah, what do you all think about that?
I think in terms of the part of the question, the last part about the figures on the right being almost irredeemable, what I like about the show is that it does show nuance on the right, so that we don't think of the right as being just the Nazis, right? So that's our go-to villain is a Nazi. And this show shows us that there have been some really great conversations around this in the last few weeks about the revanchists, right? So those who want to reinstate the Kaiser. And so that there were these different groups fighting against, to undermine the democracy, and the Nazis were sort of these upstarts that certainly were there from the early 20s onward, but did not really gain a foothold, especially not in Berlin. And this idea of the military constituting a state within the state, I think that's an important contribution that the show does give to our understanding of Weimar history. Hindenburg was basically the Kaiser by the end of World War I anyway, right? I mean, he and Ludendorff, who makes a short appearance in the description of the Operation Prangertag, had it gone well, Ludendorff, who was also a major, right, general working with Hindenburg in World War I, he would have become the acting political head until the Kaiser would come back, right? So, or he would become police president, I don't remember. They wanted, you know, to become a major figure again. And he played a large role at the end of the Weimar Republic in undermining that. So I think, yeah, and in terms of the Nussen character, I don't know. We talked, you know, you all talked about this last week. There are some moments when he's at least, you know, he has different facets to him, right? So I would just put it like that.
Yeah, and actually Linda in the comments just actually made a good point. She said, even Nussen doesn't seem 100% evil. She says, maybe it's because of how Lars Eidinger portrays him, but there are times when you can almost feel sorry for him because he is henpecked by his mother and also very manipulated by Sorokina. So he's like more of a pathetic figure, she says, and not necessarily hateful, you know, aside from his politics and the things that he's involved in, which I think is a really good point. And I was also, I'm sorry.
No, but and the point about Benda being involved in the May 1st, which is something Hester has certainly brought up. Yeah, I think that's, you know, again, Raleigh, you made this point at the end of last week, right? That the institution was also, you know, this idea of the Berlin police. Over the years, they've been involved in some pretty dicey operations, right? But the May 1st was definitely another instance, and one of the major instances in late Weimar Berlin, when a potential alliance within the left, between the SPD and the communists, to provide a counterweight to the right, failed because of this fear on the part of the Social Democrats that the communists were the greater threat. And I was reading some articles this week about the fear that the first president of the Weimar Republic, Friedrich Ebert, had about things going the way they went in the Soviet Union, right? So with the Bolshevik Revolution, he said, we will not have bloodshed like that here in Germany. And so he made a pact with the former military to quash the Spartacus uprising, and that was the sort of deal with the devil that really undermined the possibility of an alliance on the left. So it's really tricky, but that is one of the things in the series that is rather historically accurate.
Yeah, and I was also going to say, Hester, like sort of coming around back, like staying kind of on the topic of the portrayal of these sort of, I always learned the term Kaisertreu, but like the Schwarze Reichswehr, these guys who, you know, are planning to try to reinstate the Kaiser, and sort of the element of camp that is sort of, that these people, that everything, that every time these guys show up on screen, there's some element, and as well as Nussen, that there's like imbued with camp undertones when these guys show up. And it was actually kind of funny to me because I'm sure, you know, I mean, these people were suspected throughout. I mean, I'm sure it was one of those things where it's like, it's no secret that these guys are up to no good, but it just kind of amused me that, you know, when they're like, oh yeah, you know, like we got to find the main people who are responsible for this. And I'm thinking, maybe like the 4 guys walking around Berlin who are still in their World War I uniforms all the time. I would start with them. Like, like they might be the suspicious people that you would want to start looking at. But I have a feeling that they already were suspicious of them. It's just, yeah, that they were very protected, you know, and it was hard to get to them. They needed to build a case, like was repeatedly sort of expressed. But yeah, that element of camp seemed to come through a little bit in that too, where I was like, yeah, it's probably those guys.
Well, I think we're going to take a break before we consider whether we are moving on to season 3, you know, of more Watch-Klatsches about season 3. But I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that in season 3, Seeger's leftist radical daughter comes into the show as a character. And this kind of campy quality of the military elite is really highlighted by her character and the sort of confrontations that she provokes. So I think that's an interesting point that you're making, that the show itself sort of seems to really be playing with as we move forward.
Yeah, and one thing I was also going to come back around to that I think, at least in rewatching these 3 episodes, sort of like was a real gut punch was, as Hester, you pointed out in the sort of prompts, the gratuitous violence against women that's just perpetuated constantly, and namely against Lotte. And I was going to say 2 comments sort of on the whole process of the whole sequence of Lotte being tortured like that. The first being that, I don't know if they know this, the creators knew this, but I'm one of those people who always likes to point out tropes, when things pop up in media. And I know that, there's a specific term, and I think it came from an old comic, one of the superhero comics, called Fridging Women. Are you all familiar with that term? It's like basically the idea that like a woman who has a very powerful, she has a very powerful presence, she's smart, she's savvy, she's getting stuff done, she's unstoppable, but suddenly there just comes out of almost nowhere this plot point that just takes her all the way back down to the lowest possible point and dehumanizes her awfully. And I think the term woman in fridge, that came from one of these, I think it was Spider-Man, Superman, where one of Superman, I forget, Spider-Man or Superman, sort of goes through this process where, he has a girl that he likes, and then one day, and she's very smart and she's very savvy, but then one day he finds her literally cut up in a fridge. And then it sort of just brings her storyline, all that development, to an abrupt end, and sort of undoes a lot of the stuff that they had developed. And so, and then it becomes sort of from there, like a plot point for him to sort of avenge her death. And so I was thinking, she's literally being fridged in this situation. She's being kept in the meat locker. But I was thinking, what do you all think was the point of having all of that go on for her? Like, I would want to think that the creators would know better than to do something as gratuitous as that, but I'm not so sure. And also, there was one thing that I did not necessarily pay attention to my first watch that I noticed the second time, but that Lotte wakes up naked, and then it's never mentioned. Like, why are you naked? I need to know, and then the next time we see her, she's clothed again. So I don't know, do either of you have any thoughts on those things? Like, why is she suddenly just going through this odd arc where it's like all of these things that we, that she's savvy, she's smart, she gets stuff done, and she's a fighter, and then all of a sudden she just gets brought down to this such dehumanized level that it's almost like, was that necessary?
If we're talking about sort of, the symbolism and the tropes, it's actually worse than a meat locker because it's a fish locker specifically. Oh, so I'll just throw them the
I was going to say, yeah. I mean, just the fish gutting, it reminds me of, Hester knows much more about this film that I'm going to mention than I do, but the Lives of Others, when the female protagonist gets transported from one place to another as part of a sort of definite manipulation of her, she's transported in a fish truck. So this whole idea of fish and women and sort of this trope for women's genitals or what have you, right? So that is, to me, also this level of the grotesque in Babylon Berlin, when she's in the freezer with all the fish and has to watch the bald man that she beat upside the head and kicked in the crotch, take the innards out of the fish. That's this sense of this could be done to you. And yeah, I mean, this is very disturbing to me as I think I conveyed quite strongly, that I just think it's the number of ways she's beaten about is really unnecessary. And in terms of the mystery of her waking up, it's once she says that she'll cooperate, she wakes up in a sheet, basically. And I also thought about that. I thought, well, what, why? Are they trying to make us think that they were nice enough to then wash her clothes, right, to get the
That's what I was thinking, like,
that,
you smell
right?
so bad.
I think that's what they actually want us to think. I think that they thought this was a very practical thing, right? Edgar will now let her have a bath and get all cleaned up before he asks, and give her some nice food before she tells him what he wants to know.
Which reminds me, sorry, I was going to say, which reminds me, I'm so obsessed with tropes. It reminds me of another trope: bathe her and bring her to me. Like when a woman who's kind of a spunky character throughout, I don't know, Indiana Jones, Star Wars, these kinds of characters, when they come into the hands of a villain, there's always that, bathe her and bring her to me, and it's, the first time I watched it, I was like, please tell me they're not going to do that. And then they did. Or
yes,
they might have.
Implicitly, yeah. And I think that lends itself to the scene that immediately follows, which is that, she gives the information, she's allowed to go, but then she steps into the restaurant and finds her little sister there, in this very creepy scene with Edgar, which he plays to everyone plays it to the hilt, where he, especially the line where he says, anytime we know your address, right? And so there's this moment of sheer terror in Lotta's face, that he knows how to get to her. He knows how to get to the person she cares about the most, which is her younger sister, and hence, this running, this sort of, running away from the Mocha FD. And I believe that's the last time we see the Mocha FD.
Yeah, and I was just on that topic of especially Edgar with Tony. Linda and Marlon have commented on that scene and like what we are to make of that. Is it some, like whether it's like he's, a humanizing thing where he's offering her a dessert mixed with some manipulative sort of really sinister undertones that sort of, I don't know, sort of, come together, or maybe it's, definitely not humanizing, but more in the vein of manipulation. But I was wondering what you all thought, because I noticed in these 3 episodes, there's sort of 2 parallel storylines of children being groomed by people, and one being, I think, Tony, who is constantly being surrounded by men and who are trying to manipulate her, and then the other one being quite different, but at the same time I would consider it to be grooming, which is Moritz's relationship with Walter, and Walter knowing that this is interestingly enough, it's like, I can't trust Walter anymore, I need to get my family out of here, but at the same time Moritz still keeps coming into Walter's orbit, and he still is sort of, having this mentor role that I would really probably categorize more as grooming. But I was curious what you all thought about that, like these 2 sorts of portrayals of how children are being manipulated by adults in this particular set of episodes.
I think it's really important also for the show's interest in the topic of, what's happening historically and how history unfolds, and as we know, in the next couple of years, because we see these 2 children who start out as being quite young and quite innocent, who are exactly, as you said, groomed and manipulated by the adults around them in really despicable and violent ways. And both of those characters, Moritz and Tony, will play also an important role in season 3 of the show as they get older. And if you go ahead and start watching season 3, for those of you who haven't, Moritz, the actor, he was actually so young when they shot season 2, and then he kind of grew up in season 3. So even though there's only a month or 2 elapsing ostensibly between season 2 and 3, he looks to be really quite a bit older, and he's really not a child anymore. But the show actually, I think, uses that in a really deliberate fashion to emphasize his kind of politicization under the tutelage of these kinds of types like Voltaire who are grooming him as a child in this season. So I do think it's very deliberate and very, very important on the part of the show. And I don't think there's anything humanizing about what Edgar is doing with Tony. I think it's absolutely, you know, Edgar demonstrating his knowledge of Lotte, his pervasive knowledge of her, both where she lives, as Jill says, and also who is closest to her heart. And that's, you know, and he's planting that seed with Lotte so she exactly knows what he knows about her, which is his kind of MO in general, right? We've seen him do the same thing with Gerion Rat in a previous episode.
Yeah, and I was also thinking about just sort of the sort of discourses that come up around sort of the coming of age of boys and coming of age of girls, and sort of that awful thing that I feel like I hear way too often, which is the quote, girls mature faster than boys. And I remember once reading somewhere where it's like, no, girls are sexualized earlier and therefore they have to sort of, or, you know, they're exposed to more gross things at younger ages, and as a result they don't mature faster. They have to adapt to this sort of socialization that they're being exposed to as they get older. And I think, you know, I mean, I see that that's something that seems to be developing with Tony. And on the other hand, I think Moritz's sort of coming into maturity is sort of like, it's sort of being initiated into that sort of toxic masculine sort of cult of, you know, guns and yeah, and phallic things, and ultimately who, I mean, I would guess that he would probably have grown up to be a Nazi party, you know, I mean, given where he is right now and sort of the people who are influencing him.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said about Tony and this idea of girls being exposed to sort of sexual predatory behavior, you know, it reminds me of some of the scholarship I've read about fears during the Weimar Republic regarding wayward youth, right? So this was a big fear, especially after World War I or even during the war, right? Kids growing up in single parent households or what have you, or poor kids living in the cities. And that when it came to talking about wayward boys, it was always boys who were out of work, right? So young boys who were not in school and they couldn't find a suitable line of work to keep them occupied. But with girls, it was always, they're sexually promiscuous, right? So with boys, it's about, can they fit into a work life? And with girls, it's, will they slide into prostitution, which in my opinion is work. And in the discourse of quite a few writers at the time, it was considered work, but of course not in more conservative circles or even mainstream circles. So yeah, I mean, one sees this, you know, this, it wasn't in these episodes we just saw, but the previous ones for last week, where there's the negligee and the icky brother-in-law and his friend who are eroticizing Tony at such an early age.
Yeah, and I was, gross. And so I was just gross. But I was just gonna say, sort of in conclusion, I sort of had Jill, one final question for you, and Hester, one final question for you. So let me see which one might be better to go first. Jill, actually, this was just kind of something that I noticed throughout also, not only just in my time in Berlin, just walking by buildings and seeing sort of nameplates in Neukölln and Kreuzberg, on apartment buildings and stuff. But I started to realize that this was a thing that was sort of popping up often in the show as well, in portrayals of these people's names in Berlin. I noticed that a lot of the people in the working class have Polish names. They have like Krajewski or Wilczek, or these names that sound not German but more Eastern European. And my guess would be that those people sort of came from East Prussia, I mean, this is my guess, but that they came from East Prussia into Berlin. And I was wondering if, you know, because a lot of these, almost all of the people who were represented with these kinds of names seem to be very poor or very working class. And I thought of the Heinrich Heine poem about the Schlesischen Weber, which is, of course, 1848, but, you know, it's the idea of, you know, the poverty that they were living in the provinces. And I was wondering if, do you have any knowledge on that, like, sort of the movement of people from the provinces, like, of Prussia into Berlin, like, that a lot of these people seemed like they lived in poverty and had to deal with, you know, the more adverse conditions?
I mean, Berlin was a major draw for, I mean, my area of research is more about, you know, single young women who came to Berlin to try to make it better than they would have in the beleaguered economy, it's sort of failing agrarian economy, or a textile-based weaving economy that then also was taken over by the process of industrialization. In terms of today, right, I mean, that would be, yeah, older waves of migration, I think you're right, or came from Silesian and East Prussia and the provinces. And in terms of today, one could also imagine, right, the various waves of post-World War II, post-wall, right? So it would depend on how old, how many generations of migrants we're talking. But certainly in terms of my own interests, I was fascinated by this idea of a woman who, or a young woman, perhaps usually teenagers, who left home to try to make it either as a factory worker in the city or as a maid, right? So Goethe is definitely a trope that one finds all over the literature of the late 19th century. That's, you know, so she's a kind of Wilhelmine figure, in my opinion. You know, yes, she is a foil for Lotte, as Hester had said, but for me, she's also the Wilhelmine, one of the Wilhelmine elements in the series, which I think are quite a few, right? The men who can't take off their uniforms from the Wilhelmine, right? Who want the Kaiser back. But I think it shows, or Mahler playing, right? I think that I like that about the series, that there's a lot of references to Wilhelmine Berlin, because it didn't just disappear, right? So I'm interested in figures like Goethe, who tried to make it by working in a home of a bourgeois or you know, upper class family, and then was either seduced by the, right, that's a trope, right, the maid who gets seduced by the man of the house. That's not the case here, but she gets seduced by this, you know, that makes it more modern, I think, by the communist, maybe, right, Fritz. And or someone like Lotte, who is so Berlin, right? So where her family has been there for ages and ages, but to think of, this goes back episodes and episodes, but to season 1, there is this neighbor who has the Polish name as well, right? So or you know, a very, you know, Slavic sounding name, Frau Cechevich, who has this exchange with her mother when she comes back from the doctor. So yeah, I think that shows us, right, also the Berlin of the streets, the Berlin of you know, mass migration, that there's a lot of complexity there, and a lot of class unrest, and as Hester has said before, right, income disparity. And I mentioned Stresemann's reforms of the currency, but that the attack on the hyperinflation actually brought with it a lot of compromises to the social safety net for the poor, that then never got rebuilt. So things that were actually much more secure during the Wilhelmine era for the poor got eroded in the early Weimar years, unfortunately, right? So even by the sort of liberal coalition, but with some of these more conservative elements like Stresemann, and yet those are considered some of the defenders of democracy. Yeah. So it's really, really complex.
And I think I just would add to that I think Berlin, you know, one of its main characteristics as a city historically is as a center of labor migration, always, right, up until the very present day.
Yeah.
And so, labor migration of, people from other parts of Germany, as you're pointing out, Jill, to the metropolis. And Berlin was growing, just massively, dramatically during the years of the show, during the entire, first part of the 20th century, just doubling, tripling in population because of this kind of labor migration from, from within Germany and also from parts farther away. And so I just wanted to pile that point on. I think that's and it's reflected, I think, in all different kinds of ways in the show, but also like a preoccupation of German cinema has been, looking at Berlin through that lens, the lens of labor migration.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting also that Lotte lives specifically in Neukölln in a Mietskaserne, and that present-day Neukölln, although it's, these people are sort of being gentrified out now, but that Neukölln has for quite a while been known as a primarily Turkish neighborhood. And I remember, well, this is just tangential, but like the first time I was ever, I think it was on Karl-Marx-Straße or Sonnenallee, when I just heard horns honking, bunch of them, and then my friend telling me, oh, this is what the Turkish folks do when they have a wedding, and they just have like a big parade of honking cars going down the Sonnenallee. So I just thought that was just kind of an amazing like sort of reflection of how that neighborhood, the way we see it in the show, where it's mostly people who have been there forever, like Lotte's family, but also people who have moved there from other places to find work and live in poverty, and has sort of transformed now into this sort of neighborhood where it is still very heavily populated by Turkish German folks, and I think probably since the 70s. But and so my final question, and Hester, I mean, it was directed at you, but I mean, I would be curious to hear what both of you, and also what anybody in the audience thinks about this final question, because Hester, I thought this was a really interesting question you posed, which is this sort of heroic stopping the assassination. And even Benda in the car after this saying to Rat, he's just like, you realize you stopped an assassination, you stopped a coup tonight, and it was so, I don't want to say cheesy or hokey, but it reminded me a little bit of sort of these, alternative history things, especially what Quentin Tarantino's been up to in the last couple of years. I mean, I love those movies, but Inglourious Basterds, the end of that movie, you're just like, why? And then same thing with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where it's like, oh, the Manson murders don't happen. And it sort of reminded me of that, where it's like, and Hester, as you mentioned, this sort of entertaining the fantasy of stopping the far right from moving forward. And, it's almost like, like he just swoops in and he's got the gun right before the moment. It just, I was wondering what you all thought about, like why it was so almost, I don't want to say cheesy, but it was very cinema. It's very Hollywood, that the kind of idea of like, oh yeah, we stopped just in time. And that,
I mean, I think you make a good point. Like the show is really employing these kind of genre markers really strongly during these episodes, more so than during some of the previous portions of the series. And I think it really does that in order to take us along with this fantasy. I've been stressing all along that one thing I think is really interesting about the show is the way that it tries to plunge us into this world of Weimar. I mean, obviously we have this historical knowledge, and we cannot separate our view of Weimar culture and of the time really from our knowledge of how things turn out. On the other hand, I think the show is very interested in this kind of gambit of plunging us into the world and trying to kind of cultivate our fantasy about what it would be like if you didn't know what the outcome was. And I really like that aspect of the show because I think you know, there's a certain kind of potential of that use of genre and fantasy and pop culture, and insofar as the show is very interested in drawing connections between the past and present, you know, I think there's something that works for me, even though it is kind of cheesy, about that alternate history. But I mean, it only also works because the show immediately reneges on it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's very important, that slide that I showed where Benda says, you know, we lost. And the sort of tragic moment that those characters experience there, I think, you know, is absolutely necessary for the show to do. And Tarantino doesn't do that, right? He does not return us to reality in that way.
Not at all.
So I think there's kind of a fundamental difference there, in terms of, you know, this topic of revisionist history or whatever that we've been discussing. You know, I do think the show kind of has it both ways, and that it's important that it does have it both ways, because it's able to generate kind of interpretive complexity around, you know, what really this period was about, without somehow unduly romanticizing it, or like insisting on an outcome other than the reality, right? Jill, I don't know if you want to.
I completely agree, right? So I think that there is this sense of, you know, they want to build dramatic tension and not have us think about, constantly think about what the end of the Republic was, because that is 4 years down the road. So I think they really do want to put us try to put us back in that perspective of not knowing what's going to happen, but also give us the awareness that these coup planners are going to keep planning the coup, because they're all still there and they're all running free, and there's been no indictments, and there's been no, you know, the people who are on the run at the end of these episodes are, you know, Kattelbach is holding a pistol in his bed and waiting to be the next one to be shot, because he has written a key article about the Schwarze Reichswehr. Gerion, right, as usual, is in sort of Netherland, of, you know, who knows where his affiliations are, but Benda has really, you know, politically been defeated, and even though the flag is still flying, it's really in peril, right? There's still all these guys in the trucks and with all the weapons that waiting for the next chance. And you know, I recently read a really great article by a political scientist who works in Jena, in Germany, who said, you know, the rise of Hitler was a coup from the right wing, by the right wing elites. That's the only way to see it. So these coup planners are going to be the key players in the rise of Hitler. I mean, that is a fact.
So I'm going to go ahead and say thank you. Well, first of all, thanks so much to everybody who stuck around for kind of like Q&A plus, because we had so much ground to cover, but it was a lot of fun to just sort of rust into all of that, because there's so much in those 3 episodes to sort of pick apart. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to thank both you, Jill, and Hester, as well. I mean, I think the presentation was so awesome that you guys were able to do this together, and I think it was really great. Yeah, I'm so glad that you were able to join us, Jill, and Hester, thanks as well for joining, and, you know, continuing with us with this series, is what I'm trying to say. And of course, thank you to everybody who joined today and sort of submitted your comments and questions. I think it is actually really interesting to have the Q&A and the group chat sort of run together, because I hadn't seen that yet. I mean, because we had Q&A and chat separate in the webinar. But yeah, it's interesting to see everything run together. But yeah, thank you all so much for supporting our programming by joining us. And I see that some people mention, that hopefully we do season 3. And so we are thinking about it. We're still trying to figure out when we might do that. But once again, another thank you to the Friends of the Goethe-Institut for helping us with the support in terms of the funding for this program. We really appreciate them so much for being kind enough to lend us some funding to help us do this. And having said that, next week we will have our final conversation on July 2nd. We will have the final conversation on episodes 7 and 8. And just as a nugget of information, I was interested in seeing if the two stars of the show, Volker Bruch and Liv-Lise Fries, would be able to do something like record an intro or, I don't know, join. It was a pipe dream, but I reached out to their agent who they share, and she responded to me that they are unavailable because they are shooting. So I was like, so they are back to shooting season 4. So we might, in fact, have Babylon Berlin season 4 sooner than we thought because of the whole situation with COVID. So just a little bit of intel. But yeah, so that was kind of exciting to hear. So yeah, thanks again so much. We really appreciate it. And we hope you join us next week for our final Watch-Klatsch. Hester and Jill, do you have anything else sort of to say? Farewell.
Thank you, Raleigh, as always, for your wonderful moderation and participation in the conversation. And it was really great to have you, Jill, joining me for this Watch-Klatsch. It was super enriching to have you on screen and in dialogue officially. I know you've made a lot of great contributions throughout this whole series. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
It was my pleasure, and thank you both so much for including me. I will be back next week behind the scenes. I think I only have one question. But no, thanks to all of you for the great comment. I've been really enjoying watching the various comments and questions, and but it was so fun to work with you, Hester, on the presentation and the questions and the outline. And total pleasure. Thank you both so much.
Okay, and thanks to all of the audience members, as always, for all the great comments and questions. And I hope to see everyone again next week. Take care.
Take care. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.